Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I wanted to talk about two basic subjects. One is a continuation of our long covering of the situation in Gaza. A sad story which has involved the killing of so many families, even babies in incubators, the destruction of homes and of lives, and for literally no reason other than total and complete greed. It devastates me when I think about that situation, and I don't like feeling powerless over situations. I always want to find a way to help. That's just my disposition. But I realize that in this case, I really can't. I really can't. And so I guess I would say, condemned to live a life of helplessness, where I watch the daily stories, read about the horrendous situation in that part of the world, but at the same time recognize that I am living thousands and thousands of miles away from that place. And as far as I know, there is nothing concretely I can do. That is a real tragedy to me. But I've discussed that many times before. Here's what I wanted to introduce into the discussion this time. There is a philosophy which was developed by a guy in New York City named Eli Siegel called Aesthetic Realism. It's a fascinating philosophy. If you Google it, you'll find a lot of stuff on it, and you can read about it for yourself. Over the years, it has had some, I guess one could say, controversial ideas associated with it. But fortunately, those controversies have been settled, and aesthetic realism has formally abandoned all of its controversial ideas, which I always saw as literally a contradiction to the basic ideas of aesthetic realism. And I'm happy to see that aesthetic realists finally came to see it the same way as I did. I'm not going to get into what they are, because that would be a diversion from the points that I want to make here. What Eli Siegel said is that the problems that we see around us in the world are a result of what he called contempt. Contempt. Contempt for the other. Contempt for difference, or even seeming difference when there is no real difference. But just contempt. Contempt was the word that he used to describe the condition that he felt needed to be overcome by the practice of aesthetic realism. And so there are courses that are offered in aesthetic realism. To my regret, the Center for Aesthetic Realism is located in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. As far as I know, there are no other branches around the country or around the world. And although I was born in Manhattan, I have not lived there in a long time. And so here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, I really have no direct access to aesthetic realism except by reading the books of Eli Siegel and others, which go into depth in explaining the philosophy. Here's why I think it's so important. When I look at Benjamin Netanyahu, when I look at the Israeli Defense Forces, when I look at the fact that about 80% of Israelis support the terrorist campaign in Gaza, the best word I can think to describe it upon reflection is contempt. Pure and utter contempt. Contempt is not rational. Certainly, the contempt by Israelis for Gazans makes no sense at all. Israelis, for the most part, Gazans, for the most part, are Semites. My former dentist, and I say former because she was my dentist in Kansas, a place I'd left just under a couple of years ago, and I couldn't take her with me. She's still back up in Kansas, but I miss her because she was not only my dentist, she was also a good friend. And she was a Gazan, and she wore a hijab, a head covering. She was a very wonderful and warm-hearted person. If I did not know any difference, having grown up in New York City as an Ashkenazi Jew, I would have thought that she was an Ashkenazi Jew herself. Why? Because she looked like one. She had the identical facial features that are ordinarily associated with Ashkenazi Jews, including the bump on the nose, which I had too, until it was taken from me by an ear, nose, and throat physician, actually without my consent. I assume he thought he was doing me a favor, and I don't know. I really don't care one way or the other. But I had that bump on my nose too, but it's not there anymore. But when I had that bump on my nose, she could have been my sister, my younger sister. She was about 20 years younger than me. And so when I look at the attitudes of so many Israelis who support this terrorist campaign in Gaza, what I see is not only people having contempt for the other, but also having contempt for the imaginary other. Because in reality, people like myself and people like my dentist are both Semites. That's why we looked alike. And yet that seems to have gotten lost somewhere along the line. And I don't know how. I wish I did. But hatred is not a rational emotion. It's not based on reason. I mean, there's no reason to hate someone. It makes no sense. It accomplishes nothing. I mean, if I hate someone, who am I hurting except myself? But in this case, because of the extreme military power, which is possessed by the Israelis under Netanyahu, much of it provided by US President Joe Biden, that contempt is manifested in the real world and has led to the tragic deaths of so many people. So many people. People who now have no homes. Babies in incubators killed. All under the pretense of killing or destroying Hamas. Hamas babies. I guess Hamas potential babies. Babies who I guess they assume will grow up to be members of Hamas. Now, do I have anything against Hamas? I have addressed that question before, and the answer really is twofold. One, I do not support what is called in Arabic Islamia, which is translated into English as Islamism. It's basically a kind of Islamic theocracy, the creation of a state of Muslims run according to Islamic law. No, I don't believe in religious states. So I would have to say, no, I do not agree with that particular aspect of Hamas, that particular objective of Hamas. But when it comes to what Hamas is actually doing in Gaza, I see them as heroes. I mean, how else can I see them? It would make no sense to me to see them in any other light. They are the protectors. They are the defenders of the Gazans. When they had their prison break into Israel, which resulted in the deaths of numerous Israelis, more than 1,000 Israelis, that was called a terrorist act. I would not call it a terrorist act. Again, to me, it was a prison break. On the other hand, the activities of the Zionist entity in Gaza, to me, represent a type of state terrorism. Israel was founded on the basis of state terrorism. It has always been a state terrorist country. How can you separate Israel from state terrorism? Taking the lands of indigenous people, the Palestinians, pretending that the land was unoccupied, spreading that. Pure lie. Pure lie. I was told that myself when I was in Hebrew school. And not knowing any better, I believed it. I mean, I was a kid. When I found out that it was a lie, I felt nothing but anger. Not necessarily anger against the people who told me the lie, because for all I know, they might have believed the lie themselves. I don't know. I can't prove it one way or the other. So I'm not going to make any assumptions about them as individuals. But that is a lie that the formation of Israel, the Zionist entity, was based upon. that they went into a desert and transformed it into a land of valleys and flowers. That is the lie. That is the lie. Palestine was not like that at all. And yet, till this day, many people believe it. So there we have a further example of contempt. In other words, in my view, contempt is often unconscious, unintentional, inadvertent. The person who has that contempt is not necessarily always aware of why they have it. And they may actually believe the lie, which is the source of the contempt. How many Israelis would fit into that category? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm sure there are some, and I'm sure there are some who simply don't give a damn. I know some people like that, or knew some people like that. I have not been in touch with that family in quite a number of years. But they didn't care about the Palestinians at all. They cared about themselves. They stole the land of an indigenous people, and they took it for their own use. That's called colonialism. Imagine if I, after having read the research done by physical anthropologists and others, which found that there was a woman who was the maternal ancestor of all humanity. She has been nicknamed Eve for obvious reasons. She lived a long time ago, a long, long time ago. What that does in a positive sense is it can bring us together and make us realize that we are all one people, that we all share common origins. But what if, hypothetically, I and several of my friends got together and decided that we would go to Africa, seize a portion of it, kick the existing residents out, colonize it, and make it into our own land, even though we have no indigenous relationship to it. I am not an indigenous African. I visited Africa once, Congo, but I'm not indigenous to that continent at all. I know some people who are, and they have a strong fondness for it, a love for the land that they come from. It is not a love that I share, but it is a love I respect. And so, by my and my friend hypothetically going into Africa and colonizing a portion of it, kicking out its residents, who are the indigenous inhabitants of that area, and claiming it to be our land, maybe our promised land. Well, how is that different than what the Zionists did in 1948 when they founded the State of Israel. They were not the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. There were indigenous inhabitants of Palestine who lived there already. They were forcibly removed or killed, and only a small number were allowed to remain in what became Israel. So again, we return to contempt. Eli Siegel's notion of contempt in his Aesthetic Realism, not caring about the indigenous people of a land, the people who are of that land, the people who are the children of that land as their mother, and wrongfully seizing it, colonizing it, and turning it into their own colony. The story I told has happened many times throughout the history of humanity, even though the example I gave obviously is fictitious. But it's fictitious and also based on an actual historical discovery, namely that we are all descendants of this maternal woman from Africa. She is our ancestor. That does not make us indigenous inhabitants of Africa. Just as the legends of Israel, which I assume are a mix of truth and fiction, do not make the Israelis the indigenous inhabitants of Israel or Palestine. And they never have. And no matter how long Israel continues to exist, they never will be the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. They will always be the other, as well they should be. They will always be the outsiders. Sadly, they have turned the actual indigenous people of that land, the Palestinians, into those very outsiders, the subaltern in their own part of the world. It is not for me to forgive them or not. I have no right to forgive them because it was not my land that was taken away from me. I don't have the authority, the moral authority, to forgive the Israelis for what they have done and for what they are continuing to do in Palestine. Basically seizing Gaza and presumably eventually forcing the remaining Gazans into Egypt, into a penal colony in Egypt, much as Gaza was already a penal colony. So no, I can't forgive them because I have no right to forgive them. I have no prerogative to forgive them. It's not my land that was taken. The only ones who can offer that forgiveness, if they choose to, and I'm not sure if I would if I were in their situation, are the Palestinians. And yet, ultimately, if we follow the ideas of Eli Siegel, The Israelis will need to end their contempt, their clear contempt for the Palestinians in calling them neo-Nazis. That would be the essential prerequisite, in my view, for any kind of resolution to the current crisis that is going on in that region. Will there be a resolution? Personally, I don't think so. I think the resolution will be the end of the First World, the end of the capitalist world system, dominated by the US, and perhaps secondarily, Israel, and after that, maybe Britain and some other countries. But I am happy, to be honest, that I am not in a situation where I have to worry about whether to forgive people like the Israelis. I would not want to be in their place. I would not want to. Because on the one hand, I might feel that as a moral human being, forgiveness is a quality I should acquire. But on the other hand, I would think, how can I forgive people who murdered babies in incubators? How? How? That is the question I would ask. Do I have an answer? No. And I won't even pretend to offer one, because it is not my place to do so. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.